if President Trump concludes that President Putin is acting in bad faith and is somehow laughing at him, and I think President Putin is doing that, but if President Trump begins to believe that he is losing face over the entire process, not least because of the Russians' acts on the ground and this what appears to be the early stages of an offensive, then that may trigger President Trump taking a different approach. But only time will tell.
And also, let's cover Russia's strike on the city of Sumy. It's a deadly strike of the Russian Federation this year, killing more than 35 people and more than 100 people were wounded. Also, it's interesting moment that these strikes happened after Steve Witkoff meeting with Russian dictator Vladimir Putin. What is your reaction to this, and do you see any kind of link between these meetings between Witkoff, Putin, and Russia's strikes on civilian population?
Well, who knows? All I would say is that the Russians, they're a canny bunch, as you well know. You all in Ukraine know better than any of us. And they tend not to do things like this by accident. They're masters at sending messages. So let's be absolutely clear. The strike on Sumy was absolutely despicable. It's a war crime. There's absolutely no justification for it. And oh, by the way, President Trump's throwaway comment that he's heard that it was a mistake, it does a great disservice to the victims of that strike, to the population of Sumy, and indeed to the whole Ukraine nation. And it does a great disservice, frankly, to the intelligence apparatus as a whole that knows full well what President Putin and the Russians are doing. It also points to the fact that regrettably, the Russian disinformation campaign, and anyone who is familiar with Russia's tactics knows, long before the Ukraine campaign, that they are masters at disinformation. It is a centerpiece of their military and their state doctrine. And what is terrifying is it appears that disinformation arm is having an effect in the White House. I mean, how extraordinary is that? How naive is that? That members of the United States administration could be parroting that sort of disinformation.
From your perspective, who could be these people around Trump who are providing such information to the US president about mistakes of the Russian army? Who could be those people? It seems like Trump did not refer to some intelligence operations, to some intel information.
Yes, I mean, again, I think this is what's so worrying about the current situation. We all know that the United States intelligence apparatus, their interagency structure, is frankly unrivaled in the world. They have fantastic intelligence agencies. They have incredible reach. They have incredibly professional intelligence operators and analysts backed up by some of the best intelligence technology in the world. But what isn't happening at the moment, seemingly, is that the deduction from that intelligence architecture isn't finding its way into President Trump's decision-making. And whether that's because he's willfully ignoring it, whether because he's not taking the briefings, whether it's because those briefings are somehow being diluted by political advisors, it's almost impossible to tell. But I simply do not accept any suggestion that the United States intelligence apparatus, that we all have great faith in, doesn't know what's going on. Of course it does. But it's not finding its way into what comes out of President Trump's mouth, shall we say that. I don't know what goes on in his head. We can only see what comes out of his mouth and what he puts out on social media. So who is it who's giving him this kind of bizarre, perverse version of events. I don't know. You'd have to speak to people better placed than me as to who President Trump really listens to, other than his obvious administration advisors.
According to Reuters, Steve Witkoff proposed Trump to give up 4 Ukrainian regions to Russia as a part of a peace deal. According to this Reuters sources, according to Steve Witkoff, this could be the best way forward, the fastest way to broker a ceasefire in Ukraine. What could such a deal mean for Ukraine and global security, and how can you assess this Steve Witkoff's initiative?
Yeah, and if you link that with General Kellogg's comments, which I thought were again very naive and disrespectful to Ukraine, this idea that somehow you could carve up Ukraine in the image of Berlin after the Second World War, where, as your viewers will know, Berlin was split into international zones between the Soviet Union, the United States, Great Britain, and France, and that somehow that sort of model could be used in Ukraine. It is playing so strongly into President Putin's hands. You know, the whole point about a negotiation when it comes is you've got to have cards to play. And if you cede everything with that sort of proposal, then you go into the peace process with no cards to play. But more importantly, what does that then say about the rules-based international system that we all rely on? The sovereignty of Ukraine, that regions of Ukraine would be given up in that manner, I think is very damaging. And so I would have every sympathy with President Zelensky not entertaining such an approach.
Let's also cover UK and France-led coalition of the willing. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and French President Emmanuel Macron are organizing this big coalition of the willing, troops to be deployed to Ukraine after full ceasefire deal. What is your assessment of this plan?
Well, look, I have to say, I think it was smart of Prime Minister Starmer and President Macron to come up with something, a coalition of the willing, because in the absence of the United States, somebody has got to do something. You know, if there were to be a peace deal, then you've got to back it up with some kind of monitoring force. So politically, it seems to me that was a smart move by France. It was a smart move by the United Kingdom to do that, not least to say to the United States, we're listening. We're listening when you say that Europe needs to do more. So politically, I get it. Do I get it strategically and operationally? Not so much. So what do I mean by that? So firstly, it is entirely unclear to me, based on anything that has been publicized by the United Kingdom or anybody else, what the big idea of this force would be. You know, is it a peacekeeping force? You know, there's some random phrases being banded around about what the force's mission might be, without total clarity on the purpose, on the mission. Then you're in danger of running into a real disaster. And I have seen nothing to suggest if the true objective, if the true mission is understood, it certainly has been communicated very effectively. So I've seen nothing that I, as a military commander, would recognize to be a credible basis for a mission. It feels muddled at this stage. So that's the first thing. The second thing is, even once you have decided on what the mission is, and let's hope it is credible, pulling together a coalition of a willing into a credible military force is exceptionally difficult in the absence of Firstly, the United States, who have typically led coalitions of the willing. I think back to the counter-ISIS campaign as if, for instance, a US-led coalition. If it's going to be led by other nations, in this case, potentially the United Kingdom and France, where's the command and control going to come from? Because the big headquarters that could do it are NATO headquarters. And the idea that President Putin is going to permit a NATO-assigned headquarters to deploy into Ukraine, again, feels like a total fool's errand. And then come down a level, ensuring that force has the necessary credibility to do its job, I think there's a very, very long way to go. And so ministers will be saying, and they have been saying, that the planning is well advanced. Well, I hope so. But it's not what I am sensing. I'm sensing this feels like more of a political process than a true operational process. And I think it'd be very, very dangerous for Britain, for France, for these other nations involved in the coalition of the willing to deploy a force unless the mission is very, very clear. At this stage, it seems to me that it's not.
Thank you, General Jones, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Glory to Ukraine.
If Putin shows no willingness at all, which is the case at the moment, to accept a ceasefire or to compromise at all on his war objectives for Ukraine, they're completely unmodified, then the likelihood is that, Trump does have to toughen his stance and toughen his position.
Also, he has been threatening sanctions, secondary tariffs against Russia. However, it seems also that he is providing Vladimir Putin with lots of time. He is not setting any kind of a quick deadline for this. What is the reason why Trump is has a so friendly stance with Putin and giving him a lot of time for this decision on a full ceasefire?
Well, in a way, I think I've argued that an early ceasefire is not to Ukraine's advantage. So, but look, Trump has got, he's done an awful lot quickly, and a lot of it's been done spontaneously without it's difficult to detect, where there's a plan, where there's a strategy. And at the moment, there's huge preoccupation, as you're well aware, with the tariff issue and the relationship with China and the modification of that and the chops and the changes, the negotiations. My experience, which is quite extensive, of dealing with the US government is that one crisis at a time, and you've got an ongoing crisis over tariffs, is about as much as any administration can deal with. I think, in a way, as I've said already, it's to Ukraine's advantage that there isn't a hasty deal, because Russia, in my book, is in a vulnerable situation, and we need to help Ukraine to hold the line. I mean, the cost in this conflict to Russia, I was looking up the statistics in the last month, and Russia's advance militarily has slowed. The losses on the battlefield for them are over 40,000 casualties and deaths, over 5,000 pieces of military equipment, hardware. This is huge, and Ukraine is basically being very successful, not necessarily at holding territory all along the line, but in wearing down the Russian military effort. And the other point which is important to consider is what impact a further mobilization on the Russian side will have politically in Russia. Bear in mind that the people who pressurized the Russian leadership during the war in Afghanistan were Russian mothers, and they are a potent political force in Russia if the cost becomes unacceptably high. And the recruitment now, which has been in the sort of non-Russian parts of Russia, in the rural areas where families have been paid a lot of money to bring in more soldiers. We're reaching the point where he's going to have to recruit in Russian urban areas, and this politically will have a huge impact in Russia, in my view.
You just mentioned about Russia's mobilization. Vladimir Putin has just called up another 160,000 young men as in a conscription campaign. He said that they will not fight in the war against Ukraine. However, if he decides to continue war against Ukraine, if he rejects a ceasefire proposal, do you think that he will be forced to conduct another round of full-scale mobilization?
Well, absolutely, because the battlefield casualties, the fatalities have been at catastrophic levels. So these military resources, these human resources, have to be replaced. And because of the controversial nature in Russia of mobilization, and particularly in urban areas closer to Moscow, this becomes more and more problematic politically. And of course, a lot of the Russian elite, a lot of these young people who might risk being called up, I mean, large numbers have left the country. They've gone, well, places like Georgia, where it's relatively easy to get into those countries, they have left. And there's no question that this is another stress factor operating on the Russian nation as a whole. And these stresses now are really beginning to bite and to count and to make a difference.
I know it's really difficult to have the full information about Vladimir Putin's inner circle, but do you expect this stress also to rise among Russian generals, security services officials, and Kremlin's officials? Do you feel that this security and military groups around Vladimir Putin are in the support, would like to support ceasefire, or would like to continue the war?
Well, that's a difficult question to answer because, frankly, we don't know. But if we sort of speculate, and it is speculation, there must be people around Putin, particularly amongst the military leadership, who are very, very concerned about the cost of this war and the inability of the Russian military, with all of its vast resources and its vast numbers, to defeat the Ukrainian military. That's clearly not going to happen. I mean, you already are very close to a situation of stalemate. And, our perception of what was the Russian military, or going back further, the Red Army, has been changed totally by this conflict. It hasn't been able to achieve what many people would have thought for that military capability, a pretty straightforward objective. It's failed.
Let's also cover the coalition of the willing. British Prime Minister Keir Starmer and French President Emmanuel Macron and other European leaders are working to conduct this mission in Ukraine after a full ceasefire. What is your personal opinion about this concept and this plan about the coalition of the willing?
Well, I have serious reservations. I don't really understand what the thinking is behind this, because the frontier between Russian and Ukrainian forces is so long. Are we talking about military units which would police that frontier? I mean, talking to my own military contacts, one is speculating that you would need a force of 200,000. I mean, it's a huge measure, a huge business. So what does is the coalition of the willing who are going to continue supporting and backing Ukraine in this conflict? I don't see what a on-the-ground deployment would be. And the Russians, of course, would be very, very reluctant to see NATO troops policing a line of conflict or between the two armies. So I think if one is trying to sort of speculate and think about what might be practical, I think that the more likely possibility would be air cover provided as a security guarantee for Ukraine. That might possibly, but even that is difficult to imagine because of, would it be a NATO engagement? Would it be, as it were, individual countries working not under NATO command? So in my book, the only possible alternative might be some sort of air cover, which of course would be a huge security guarantee and very important. But beyond that, I'm not party to these discussions, and it's, I think, very difficult to imagine exactly what they amount to. I think we have a NATO summit coming up in The Hague in June, and I think maybe after the NATO summit, it will be easier to have a picture of what's being planned.
And my last final and quick question, do you expect, can you imagine such air cover over Ukraine without full ceasefire?
It wouldn't be possible without a ceasefire. I mean, that would be, as it were, a security guarantee following a ceasefire. And I think then this raises the whole issue. And I think for the moment, being pragmatic, being realistic, NATO membership for Ukraine is a very long way away.
Thank you, Sir Dearlove, for your time and for your support for Ukraine, and glory to Ukraine.
Well, I think it's really important that the West and Europe in particular continues to support Ukraine in every way possible. And I'm very proud of what the UK has done to support the Ukrainian military effort.
Thank you.